Welcome to another educational video about screen printing by Catspit Productions. Thanks a lot for clicking on my video today. I really appreciate your time and attention. And remember, if you like what you see, please rate thumbs up, comment when you can, and subscribe. I really appreciate that. So listen, today really quickly, I wanted to discuss some tips on how to care for your Heiser mesh counts, because a couple of my customers lately have emailed me and said, I tore one of my 230 mesh, or maybe a 300 mesh or a 200 mesh. I tore it. What can I do? Well, how did that happen? What happened? Okay, so let's talk about, there's a really big difference between a 110 white mesh, okay, and your Heiser mesh counts, which tend to be dyed mesh. Okay, this is a 200. Okay. And there's a big difference between the mesh. Basically, what you have to remember is the Heiser mesh counts are kind of like stockings. The material gets so thin that it's very delicate. In other words, at Heiser mesh counts, they have to use a lower thread diameter in order to achieve the amount of threads per inch, right? So each thread is a little bit weaker by itself. Okay, so if we bump this up on the press, or against the dryer, or against a piece of metal, or a screw, or a rough edge on a table, that will very likely cause a tear, or even what we call a run, or a puncture. Okay? So the first tip I'm going to give you is be very careful. That's very simple. Or when you're handling a Heiser mesh count, be very careful when you handle it all around the shop, in that you don't want the mesh itself to come into contact with anything really. There's no reason for it to. So don't let it. Okay, so that's our first tip. So let's talk about a few more tips that I can give you off the top of my head. I think I have a couple tips I can give you when you're in the washout booth with your Heiser mesh counts, like 200 mesh, 230 mesh, 305, 355, who knows, maybe even a 160. The bottom line is that the higher the mesh count, the more delicate or fragile the mesh will be. Okay, so your pressure washer, always be careful. If you use too much pressure on a Heiser mesh screen, you can actually tear or puncture the mesh, or even damage the way the mesh structure is, meaning that the fibers are in a grid. Well, if you get up here really close and push them around, you can actually push them around, which may or not be a problem necessarily for t-shirt printers, unless you were to kind of push a few of them open really far, you know what I'm saying? Then it could be an area where the emulsion just won't work right. Okay, so be careful not to get too close to the screen with the wand, because the closer you get to the mesh with the wand, the higher the pressure gets. Okay, and also if you have a pinpoint, an adjustable nozzle, try to use more of a fan than a pinpoint. A pinpoint can possibly easily tear Heiser mesh counts. Okay? Now, another thing that you want to consider is mesh abrasion. We've talked about this a lot, but remember, you only abrade the mesh when it's a brand new screen. Okay? So that means that after you abrade the mesh of a brand new screen once, we never want to really abrade the mesh again. And we want to try to, in fact, not abrade the mesh, because the more you wear the mesh fibers, the more they get frayed, and frays and hairs get in the mesh openings and actually ruin the ink flow characteristics, but it also makes it more delicate. The other tip I'll give you is that I will warn you to be careful on press, especially when you have the screen in between pallets for cleanup, which sometimes I do, because I don't want to rub the scraper on the bare metal pallet or the pallet tape. You know what I'm saying? I hang it off and I scrape ink off like this. Okay, but whenever you're working with spatulas, whether they be metal, plastic, whatever type you like, okay, this style is very common, okay, they can have little edges. And if the edges are sharp at all, whether they be plastic or metal, you can round them off with a little sander or a grinder. Okay, my metal ones are normally ground off. This one isn't. So if I go to scoop up ink and I accidentally go sideways, I can damage or tear the mesh very easily. Okay, so you have to be careful with your ink scoops and tools that you use to handle the ink on the mesh. Okay, that's another area where you can easily tear, pop, or damage your high mesh counts. And don't forget that haze removers are also aggressive on the fabric. So only use haze removers when in fact you have a haze or stain to remove. If you don't have very bad hazing or staining, then don't use the haze remover. A puncture or a small tear that's not gaping, we can prevent from getting any bigger and still use the screen as long as it has good tension. So all you need to do is take a piece of duct tape or Gorilla Tape, cut it with scissors so that it doesn't have strings, okay, and you're going to basically encompass the tear. If you can see this little black simulated tear, we're going to center the tear inside here and let a little bit of the tape go up on the screen, or on the frame, you know what I'm saying? So center the tear under there and then tuck the tape up like this. Okay, now what you want to do is push down on the pallet. We're flat against the pallet, and we're going to push this against the screen. And you might want to degrease the screen before you do this. That might help the tape stick better, right? If it's degreased and clean. Okay, so we're pushing this on as best we can, and then what we're going to do is we're going to flip this over. Okay, now you should be able to see that. Okay, you see how, let me see if I can get that sort of in the center for you. Okay, you see how there's a little black line. That's my simulated tear. Okay, and then the tape we just put on. So I'm going to take another piece of tape that is scissor cut, and ideally you want it to match this one. Mine doesn't really quite match, I don't think, but you get the point. Okay, if it matches really nice, it's good, because then both pieces of tape kind of protect one another from being pushed off, and you know what I'm saying, it's just better. Match them up real nice, and at this point what you can do is flip the screen back over, and we're going to push these two pieces of tape together, and in our best dreams we're going to hope that the adhesive kind of pushes through the mesh openings and gets to one another so that the glue touches glue. And I don't know if that happens on a higher mesh count, but it's possible on a 110, I suppose. Okay, and that's it. And what this does is it basically just prevents that tear, that sliver, the run, or a puncture. It prevents it from getting worse. And as long as you have mesh tension, you can do that and continue to use the screen. And don't worry if your squeegee goes over this with a little ink, it'll slide over, it'll be a little bump, but it shouldn't be really a big deal. You'll get used to it. That's it. I think this video was a little bit longer than I had hoped, but then again, I hope that you appreciate all the lovely details that I give you, all the little nitty-gritty that you don't get anywhere else. It's like a personal one-on-one tutoring session, isn't it? Yeah, very cool. So I like to do it. I have a lot of fun doing it. Please remember, I do sell screen printing equipment and supplies at catspitscreenprintsupply.com. You should be able to see that in the banners and stuff through the whole video. All right, so if you need screen printing equipment or supplies, please check me out. Give me a call if you need any help. I'm happy to help out. Thanks a lot for watching today. I appreciate your time and attention. Please subscribe. We'll see you next time.